is going on in British politics as the world shifts towards the right? Why is Britain struggling under its new Labor government? This is Ticker Hotshots. Hello, I'm Ahron Young. Great to be with you. Coming up on the program today, we're talking about UK Labor's net zero challenge. So much to get through. Also, the Reform Party's future, migration integration. What does it mean? How's it going in the UK? And also two-tier policing, that narrative. To help break it all down, we are joined today by GB News and Spectator contributor Will Kingston, an Aussie living in the UK. Great to see you.
G'day, Ahron. How are you going?
Doing very well. Great to have you here on Ticker. We've been looking forward to this one. Let's get into. Has the UK reality finally caught up with Labor after years of pushing aggressive climate targets at risk crippling the economy? The Chancellor Rachel Reeves has now admitted at the World Economic Forum in Davos that economic growth trumps other things. That is quite the shift, isn't it? The government, bound by climate laws first introduced by the Tories and supercharged by Labor, has been racing towards a 2030 carbon-free grid, blocking North Sea oil extraction and ignoring Britain's shale gas potential. But let's be clear here, this isn't just about Labor. The UK is fast becoming an outlier in the Western world. The new US president has pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. China and India powering ahead with Australian fossil fuel, yet Britain remains shackled by self-imposed economic restraints. Net zero may be unstoppable in the long run, as Ed Miliband claims, but the question we are asking today is whether the UK is moving too fast for its own good and for its own economy. Will, as we say, great to have you here on Ticker. Talk to us about some of the problems that the UK new Starmer government is facing in its first year.
Well, you say that the UK may be on their own here, but I actually don't think they are, because the Albanese government in Australia are doing the exact same thing. The thing which you have to understand is that net zero and a growth mantra in the economy are fundamentally incompatible. And unfortunately, the UK government are just slowly realising that. There's a reason why they are pumping huge amounts of subsidies into wind and solar. There's a reason why in the UK you are paying literally double for electricity compared to the US, literally double. And it is because there is this absurd goal for net zero by 2030 as you ditch coal, as you ditch every other cheaper form of energy. And the really sad thing for the people of the UK is that it is fundamentally dogmatic. It is a doctrinaire approach to energy policy. And we'll see as Trump in the US goes the other way over the next couple of years. I think we'll get to a point where the UK people will realise that we can't sustain this, particularly when all of this stuff is symbolic. The amount of carbon emissions from the UK, just like Australia, is, I don't know whether this is swearing or not, 3/5 of bugger all. And why we continue to do this when you are literally crippling people who don't have much money in the first place, I think we're hitting a tipping point both in Australia and the UK.
It is such a great point, and I've really been enjoying your podcast, Fire at Will. You should have a look for it out there. And one of the points that you and your guest recently made was that governments talk about growth, but they don't really mean it. They end up coming up with, we have growth, but we really need to do these things which unfortunately impact growth. You say that it's impossible to achieve growth while also pushing for a net zero 2030 policy that not many people believe will actually occur. What impact do you think it is having on people, particularly people who may have voted for a Labor Party to fix the cost of living crisis for them?
So, Ahron, we need to be clear. There has been no growth in the United Kingdom for the last 20 years. Australia isn't much better. The only reason you have GDP growth is because both countries have imported huge amounts of migrants. And so the top line growth figures say that you have 1 to 2% growth at max. But if you look at GDP per capita, Australia and the UK have either been in decline or flatlining for 20 years. And GDP per capita is what matters, because it's the amount of people in the country that defines how many people you have to, have hospitals for or schools for or whatever. And so every single single step change in growth over the last 200 years has come from cheaper energy. And unfortunately, now that we have this net zero mantra in Australia and the UK, they've given up on that. But politicians are saying at the same time that they can still go for growth as they are making energy more expensive. And I think we're at that point that now people are realising because they've got to pay more expensive energy bills every month, that doesn't work. And that is why you have literally the most unpopular first-term government in the UK since polls have started.
It's interesting because the Tories don't seem to be much better on these issues, right? There doesn't seem to be a really strong alternative. I think about David Cameron riding his bike around trying to essentially be that right-wing politician in the centre that got the UK really stuck on that issue of Brexit. And then comes along Boris Johnson, again, very much pro-climate change policies. So if you're someone who is struggling at the moment and you're really worried, what alternative is there in the UK when it comes to politics?
So this is the thing you've got to understand about politics for the last 14 or 15 years in the UK is that basically the Conservatives continued on the Blair agenda that he continued. It wasn't a Conservative agenda, and that is why the Conservatives now are the third party in the polls behind Reform, who I'll get to, and the Labor Party. As we've seen across the world, the last 4 out of the 15 major elections in the world have gone to a challenger party, and many of them have gone to a populist challenger party. That one in the UK now is the Reform Party, led by Nigel Farage. Australians will know Nigel Farage as the man who led the Brexit referendum. Everyone's just fed up, and they're fed up because, particularly recently, you've seen someone like Donald Trump come in and just do several common sense things around, say, DEI, around things like putting his country first. And suddenly the British people are realising, why aren't we putting our country first when we're paying so much in tax, when our country is in many ways in decline? This is unfortunately a moment where the UK people are realising there is an alternative. The bad part is there's 4 months until the next election.
Yeah, it's a very long way to go. The Reform Party gaining momentum in the UK, promising backing as well from wealthy billionaires. Even Elon Musk is interested too. The party's new treasurer claiming that the financial support will lead to unprecedented political disruption. Now, Nick Candy, a prominent property developer, aims to position Reform as the leading right-wing party, targeting Conservative and Labor voters alike. Concerns mounting in Westminster about Musk's potential contribution, which could reshape the landscape of British politics as well. So is Reform legit? We know that there are a lot of organisations, and the UK really is changing. I think about GB News, to which you're a contributor on, started by my former boss at Sky News, Angelo Frangopoulos, who's now in the UK and running GB News and doing a great job of essentially taking it and being the voice of the people outside of the city. It seems that Reform and GB News, and in Australia we've got Sky News, they're all essentially saying and pointing out, I think quite well, what we've now seen in the US, which is that city thinking doesn't work for everybody, and this kind of groupthink that occurs where we're seeing a shift towards the far left on a lot of social policies has detrimental long-term consequences that a lot of people are pulling back from and really questioning. What's your view on that?
Okay. Can I give you an example on that? Sky News in the UK is not like Sky News in Australia. Sky's News in Australia is centre-right, and I think it actually does quite a good job of telling the truth to the people. Sky News in the UK is basically like, there may not be an Australian equivalent, but it is like an MSNBC in the US, and they've just announced that they are going off and they'll be YouTube only from 2028 or 2029. Basically, no one wants to. And the reason is because they've been lying to their viewers. And the best example of this is the only channel that has been willing to talk about grooming gangs, or I like to say rape gangs, in the UK has been GB News. So Australian audiences may have heard about this now. I hope so, because Elon Musk has brought attention to it. But for the last 30 to 40 years, there have been large groups of largely Pakistani Muslim men who have gang raped British women. And because the establishment, and by the establishment I mean the police, the judiciary, the politicians, have been afraid of being called racist, this has not been brought to the surface. And there's been a couple of very brave people, Maggie Oliver, someone I've spoken to on my podcast, but largely this is something which no one has talked about. In the last month, suddenly this has exploded on Twitter because Musk has said, what the hell is going on? But GB News is the only one who's talking about it, because every other station has got this multicultural agenda that says, oh, well, if we do bring this up, we may be unfortunately labelled as a racist.
Well, it's part of that.
This is the sad,
right?
sad.
It's part of that concern that you will be isolated and pushed out if you don't toe the party line. I mean, we call it the Canberra bubble here in Australia, and there's very much a Westminster bubble as well, where everyone has shared ideas and then off they go. And it's really the outsiders who aren't anywhere near that bubble who are able to really call things out, because they're not worried about being pointed at, having the finger pointed at. You know, Sky UK for such a long time, when I worked at Sky and started off there in 2006, was the channel that did brilliant journalism, and they were so well resourced. You know, they always ran at a loss. They were seen as marketing for the Sky platform, and these days the media landscape, who cares about your platform? It's not your news service that gets you over the line these days, because you can get news from anywhere. It's really the quality of your programming and how you're able to take the fight up against the international streamers, and that's where Sky News, I guess, under its new ownership, and we saw that change when Comcast took it over from the Murdochs, that it went down, as you say, more of that left political path, or at least that groupthink political path, we could say there as well. Talk to us about the impact of that. I often say for every action there's a reaction when it comes to politics. And do you think Reform UK came about because people just got tired and what they were seeing in real life wasn't relating to what they were seeing on the TV, for example?
Yeah, on the media side, it is a difficult media environment when you've got more YouTube options, when you've got more podcast options. It's very difficult for linear television to survive. And Sky News have realised that if you're going to do the woke thing, you probably won't survive. There's a broader point around politics. And in the UK, about once every 100 years, there is a political realignment. In 1922, you had the party called the Whigs, which were the Lib Dems effectively, and they declined. Labor rose, and the Conservatives came into power, and they stayed in power for the next 36 of 42 years, I think. We're now 100 years from that point, and it is now time for another realignment. The Conservatives have been the most successful political party in the Western world for the last 200 years. And they have now, after their betrayal on mass migration, after their betrayal on the economy, after their betrayal on all manner of issues, I, having now been living here for 2 years and feeling the popular mood, the Conservative Party is done. We are now seeing one of the most extraordinary political realignments in the last century. If I have a guess, I think the Reform Party will either win or come very close to winning in the next election. And I think Australia needs to take note, because I don't think a lot of the conservative right in Australia are particularly happy with the Liberal Party. And I think it means that there is that similar level of angst. And I think across Australia and the UK, that traditional two-party system of either Liberal or Labor, or the Conservatives and the Labor Party, is in the process of being blown up. We are in a once-in-a-century moment.
It's interesting you talk about the Tories, and we think about the Liberal Party here in Australia that are in a coalition with the Nats, obviously the Nationals, and the idea is that people outside of the cities are from the bush, and the people from the bush have a different set of values to the people from the cities, and we've seen that between the Liberal Party and the National Party for some time. In the UK, the Conservatives, you know, they're there, but as you say, they've kind of veered off that Margaret Thatcher free economy, really common sense approach to migration. What are your views then on what the Conservative Party needs to do to get back there? I mean, I've listened again to your podcast where a recent guest said that what will happen is Reform will become the bigger party on the Conservative side and probably win the election and rename as the Tories, as the Conservative Party, as the Conservatives die under its current leader. What are your thoughts?
I wouldn't go quite that far just yet, but there are only three issues that matter, and that is mass migration, the economy, and net zero, and they're actually all intertwined. The fact of the matter is, and per capita, it's actually worse in Australia, but the fact of the matter is, the UK is now, the social fabric of the UK is fraying dramatically. If you look at the economics of mass migration, the vast majority of immigrants take more from the economy than they put into it. I'm an immigrant to the UK. I'm not against immigration, but the unfortunate reality is they actually haven't worked out that you actually need to work out, pick the people that you want in the country, pick the people that have the same values, pick the people that have the same language. But because there's been this kind of leftist, multicultural agenda, London is now a minority white city. Crime has gone up exponentially, and there is a deep feeling of the country in decline, and that is the reason why Reform is pushing forward. You add in the economic decline, and the bookies are right in saying that Reform will probably be the next government.
Let's talk about migration. A senior citizen has been arrested for allegedly using wigs and disguises to fraudulently take British citizenship tests on behalf of multiple applicants. It's an extraordinary situation. The Telegraph there say migrants must be expected to integrate. The incident raising serious questions about the integrity of the citizenship process across the UK. Now, public opinion on immigration remains divided. 32% of respondents viewing it negatively. Interestingly, 52% believe that the number of migrants entering the UK should be reduced. Now, the disparity highlights the complexities in how people perceive immigration's impact and also its current trends. So when we talk about migration in the UK, I often think about when I lived there and the anger that a lot of people had about people coming across from the continent, stealing jobs and jumping on the social welfare system. Is that still the case?
Yeah, it is. I don't think the question is immigration a good or a bad thing? I think the question is how many people, how quickly, and where from. And I think on each of those questions, both the UK and for our Australian viewers, Australia's just got it wrong. The multicultural or the immigration question works out well when you get high-skilled immigrants coming from cultures which are culturally compatible. So, for example, for UK, Western European countries like Italy, like Europe, like Australia, if you go down to Australia, these are all countries which will be culturally compatible. The big difference in the last 5 years is you have more and more immigrants coming from either sub-Saharan Africa or from fundamentalist Islamic countries. And the unfortunate reality is that most immigrants coming from fundamentalist Islamic countries do not share values which are fundamentally compatible with a Western liberal democracy. And that is why you have seen this cultural fraying at the seams in the UK. And it's why also, to be honest, you've seen that the fraying at the seams in Australia as well. Multiculturalism works when the cultures integrate and when there isn't problems. But I think that has changed in the last decade. And now we are at a tipping point in the UK. And I think Australia is about 5 years behind that.
It's interesting, my nana came to Australia in the 1950s from Manchester, and she said that the Australians were racist against her when she first came here. Then my mum came from Spain in the 1970s as an immigrant during the terrible Franco era, and found it very hard, obviously, with the language barrier. But the thing is that the cultures were quite similar to Australia, different language maybe being from Spain, but still quite a similar culture with very many similar values. The change in bringing different cultures, non-Christian cultures, for example, to the country. The impact of that, talk to me about your views on that, both in the UK and also in Australia, how it has happened and what impact it's had on the shape. I mean, we're now a country that struggles to celebrate Australia Day, for example. That is very new over the past 5 to 10 years. Do you think that the immigration change has led to a bit of a self-loathing within countries like, I call them the Westminster countries, where there's this fear of celebrating national identity for fear of hurting someone else? And why do you think that governments are bringing in people from different cultures as opposed to that Western European type that Australia was bringing in, for example, in the 1970s and 60s and 80s, and the same as the UK?
Ahron, I noticed you said non-Christian countries as a euphemism. Let's be honest about this. Multiculturalism worked in Australia and the UK when most migrants were coming from Western European countries, and they were coming from Southeast Asia, where there was compatibility. The problem has come when we've had large amounts of people coming from fundamentalist Islamic countries. Now, this is a massive problem. Not every Islamic person is incompatible with the country, but the fact of the matter is, out of the 50 countries which are Islamic in the world, 40 of them are basically hellholes. 47 of them are authoritarian. There are only 3 democracies. I think that's Turkey, Indonesia, and there's one more which the audience can pick me up on. But the fact of the matter is, there are only 3 democracies out of the 50 Islamic countries in the world. But we need to just start being honest about this, to say we can be accepting, we can be kind of tolerant, but there are questions to be answered around the treatment of women, the treatment of minority groups, the separation of church and state. And I think the unfortunate thing around the world right now is we're too scared to have that conversation. I think one of the things for us as a society at the moment is we mix up the legitimate criticism of culture with the illegitimate criticism of different races. I would never actually say it's because someone is black or Indian or whatever particular race that necessarily means that they will act in a particular way, because that's just not true. At the same time, cultures are different, religions are different. Religion is a belief system. Because you believe something, you can choose not to believe it, and therefore you should be challenged on it. So in the UK, for example, they are looking at introducing basically Islamophobia laws. If you choose to criticise Islam, from what we've heard, there will now be consequences, and that is a hugely devastating thing. If you're going to be racist and say that someone, because of their ethnicity, is a lesser person, then that is morally reprehensible. At the same time, if you are in a Western liberal democracy, you should be able to challenge Judaism or Christianity or Islam or whatever. My concern, and this is happening in the UK, and from what I've heard, actually, the Albanese government is looking into this as well. We're now looking at Islam as a protected category, and it just shouldn't be, because that is a belief system, that is not a race, and they've been conflated.
An internal Home Office review has labelled claims of two-tier policing as an extreme right-wing narrative. It calls for a new approach to combating extremism, focusing on harmful behaviours rather than specific ideologies. Now, despite commissioning the report, the Security Minister Dan Jarvis and the Home Secretary have dismissed its recommendations. Among the 38 suggestions, increased police recording of hate incidents and stronger measures against social media content that incites violence. It's always interesting when police start getting involved in social media and trying to ban it. What are your views?
Well, they shouldn't. Is the short answer. There is very little trust in the police in the UK at the moment, because there's been several cases of someone saying nasty things on Twitter, and by the way, like morally reprehensible things, bad things on Twitter, but they're being locked away in prison And at the same time, you see people often from an ethnic minority background who seem to be treated more leniently. There is a feeling now in the UK, and it is a widespread feeling, that people from an ethnic minority background are given more lenient sentences than the white working class, largely because of this kind of embrace of multiculturalism and this fear amongst the establishment of being called a racist. And there's now just so many examples that it's almost impossible to deny. And the UK has a massive problem here, a massive problem, which unfortunately, I'm not sure the answer unless there is kind of a rapid political change, which we're not going to get anytime soon.
Do you think that it begins with good intentions that then in the real world get tested to the point they don't work anymore?
Yes, I do. I think that's, Ahron, I think that's a really good point. Like the whole woke stuff, the whole identity politics stuff, of course it comes from a good place. It comes from a place of saying that everyone should have equal opportunities. It comes from a place of saying that discrimination is wrong. But I think what we've seen over the last 10 to 20 years is that those good intentions have now tipped to the point where they've gone too far the other way. And in the US, that led to Trump being elected. That's now led to some of the measures that we're seeing around DEI there. I think most people, and again, most Australians listening to this would say that they absolutely appreciate, respect Indigenous culture, but they voted against the voice referendum 60-40 because they went that so much of the symbolism, so much of the silly virtue signalling was something that they weren't going to tolerate. I think most common sense people now are people who go, we want everyone to live in harmony, are people who want to give everyone chances, but the balance tipped too far. And that is why you saw Trump win. That's why you saw the voice lose. And I suspect, despite it being a long way away, that is why you'll see someone like Reform or On Pin in 4 years' time in the UK.
And how do you think these sorts of perceptions affect trust in law enforcement among many various communities? As in, how do we get the police force back to the centre without losing the trust of these communities?
So I'd be careful of saying getting the police force back to the centre, because I think many of them are just trying to fulfill regulations and directions given from them from up high.
Well, that's what I'm referring to.
Yeah, so in the UK, for example, you have something called a non-crime hate incident, which is, as it says, you are not committing a crime. But if, say, you say something nasty on Twitter, which may be considered something which is hateful or nasty, and again, that is entirely at the discretion of the police force, you can have, you can be knocked on the door and said, we're not going to tell you what you've said or what you've done, but we're logging you for a non-crime hate incident. And I don't have the numbers on me, Ahron, but there's been hundreds and thousands of these that have been logged over the last decade. The most prominent one was Alison Pearson, a Telegraph columnist in the UK recently. This is where we're at, where knife crime in London has never been higher. Good luck, if you walk around with your phone in your hand, good luck actually having it there by the time it's left. It will probably be stolen from you. There are actually real crimes that are going on, but the police now, because of the diktats of a uni party class above them, are focusing more on thought crime than they're focusing on real crime. And to the initial question that you asked, that destroys trust in the police, absolutely destroys trust. I don't have an answer above and beyond. There's never been less trust in the police in the UK than what there is now.
All right, we'll leave it there for now. Will Kingston, contributor there at GB News and also at The Spectator. Great to have you here on Ticker. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Ahron. Cheers.